Ethan had never been the type to believe in ghost stories. He was a practical man, a skeptic at heart, and he always found rational explanations for things that others deemed supernatural. But what happened to him on that bitterly cold December night changed him forever. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, an escape from the noise of the city, a moment of solitude before the new year. He had driven for hours through the vast countryside, enjoying the peace of the open road. But as the night grew darker, an unexpected snowstorm rolled in, swallowing the highway in a blanket of white. Visibility plummeted, and the temperature dropped sharply. Then, his old sedan sputtered and jerked. The engine coughed violently before it died completely, leaving him stranded on an empty road in the middle of nowhere. Ethan cursed under his breath and tried the ignition again. Click, 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 nothing. His breath fogged up the windshield as he gripped the steering wheel, realizing he was completely alone. There were no buildings in sight, no gas stations or rest stops. The last town he had passed was nearly an hour behind him. His phone was just as useless. No signal. He sighed, rubbing his hands together to fight off the cold, and stepped out of the car. The silence was unsettling. The snow absorbed all sound, making the world feel eerily still. Even the wind had died down, leaving only the quiet crunch of his boots on the icy road. He stuck out his thumb, hoping that someone, anyone, would pass by and offer him a ride. Minutes dragged into an hour. The cold seeped into his bones, numbing his fingers and toes. Just as he was about to give up and start walking, a pair of dim headlights appeared in the distance. Relief washed over him as the vehicle approached, a large black pickup truck. It pulled up beside him, and the driver's window rolled down slowly. The man inside looked to be in his late 40s, his face weathered by time and the elements. His deep-set eyes seemed empty, devoid of warmth. He wore an old stained baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. "Need a lift?" the man asked in a gravelly voice. Ethan hesitated. There was something about the stranger that unsettled him, but he was freezing, and the thought of walking miles through a snowstorm wasn't an option. Swallowing his unease, he nodded and climbed into the truck. The warmth inside the cab was suffocating, almost unnatural. It smelled of old leather, stale air, and something faintly metallic. The dashboard lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows. Ethan buckled up, his unease growing stronger. "Where you headed?" the driver asked, keeping his eyes fixed on the road. "Nearest town," Ethan replied. "My car broke down a few miles back." The man nodded but said nothing else. They drove in silence, the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers the only sound. Outside, the world was a swirling blur of white. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced at the dashboard clock. 1:17. Several minutes passed. He checked the clock again. 1:17. His heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was broken. He pulled out his phone. No signal. But what truly sent a chill down his spine was the battery icon. It hadn't drained at all. It had been at 72% when he got into the truck. It was still 72%. His pulse quickened. He turned to look at the driver, noticing how stiff and rigid the man was. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He hadn't moved at all, not even to blink. Ethan swallowed hard. "How far is the next town?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The driver didn't answer. Ethan clenched his fists. "Sir?" The man slowly turned his head, his face expressionless, his eyes hollow. Ethan's stomach twisted. The man's pupils were gone. His eyes were completely black, like two endless voids staring into his soul. Panic surged through him. He yanked at the door handle, locked. The windows wouldn't budge. His breath came in short gasps as he fumbled with his seatbelt, but it refused to release. The driver's mouth curled into a slow, unnatural smile. "You were never supposed to leave," he whispered. The truck lurched forward at an impossible speed. The scenery outside blurred into a dark smear. The headlights no longer illuminated the road. They were plunging into nothingness. Ethan screamed, pounding on the window, kicking at the dashboard. His body felt heavy, like something was pulling him down. The world around him collapsed into darkness. When Ethan woke up, he was lying on the side of the highway. Snow piled around him, his body half frozen. His car was still there, broken down just as he had left it. But the road was completely empty. No tire tracks, no sign of the truck. Shivering, he stumbled to his feet, gasping for breath. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A new message. It was from an unknown number. "You were never supposed to leave that truck." Ethan never hitchhiked again. The desert highway stretched for miles, an endless ribbon of cracked asphalt disappearing into the horizon. The sky above was a deep, suffocating black, stars hidden behind a thick layer of drifting clouds. The only sound was the wind, howling across the empty plains, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass. Vanessa had never felt so alone. Her car sat motionless on the side of the road, its engine long silent, the fuel gauge needle stubbornly stuck at E. She cursed herself again for not stopping at that last gas station. Had it been 30 miles back? 40. She had lost track of time somewhere between blasting the radio and letting the endless open road lull her into a false sense of security. Now she was stranded, with no cell signal, no traffic in sight, and no idea how long she'd be standing there, waiting for help. The wind picked up, tugging at her jacket. The desert could be scorching during the day, but at night, the cold settled in like a silent predator, sinking deep into her bones. Every so often, a coyote howled in the distance, its eerie cry echoing across the barren landscape. She shivered. Then at last, headlights. A single pair of bright beams cut through the darkness, growing closer by the second. Vanessa stepped nearer to the road, raising her hand in a desperate hitchhiking gesture. The car slowed as it neared, its tires crunching against the loose gravel, before rolling to a stop beside her. It was an old silver sedan, the paint dulled by years of sun and dust. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man inside. A stranger. He looked to be in his 50s, his weathered face lined with deep creases. His hair was thinning, gray strands peeking out from beneath a faded baseball cap. His eyes were dark, sunken, and unreadable in the dim light. A heavy brown jacket was draped over his shoulders, and the smell of stale cigarettes lingered in the air around him. "Need a ride?" His voice was rough, gravelly, but there was something oddly soothing about it. Vanessa hesitated. Hitchhiking was dangerous. Everyone knew that. But what choice did she have? The nearest town could be hours away, and she wasn't about to walk that distance alone in the freezing cold. She swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, thanks. Just to the next gas station, if you don't mind." The man nodded once before unlocking the passenger side door. Vanessa climbed in. The air inside was warm, almost suffocating after the cold night air. The car smelled like leather and smoke, a thick, lingering scent that clung to the seats. As she fastened her seatbelt, she noticed something strange. The dashboard clock wasn't working. The numbers were frozen at 1:14 a.m. Odd, but before she could dwell on it, the car pulled away from the side of the road, smoothly merging back onto the empty highway. At first, the silence was comforting. The man didn't talk much, only nodding occasionally when she mumbled a quiet thanks or gave vague directions. The road stretched endlessly before them, illuminated only by the sedan's weak headlights. The desert outside was a black void, featureless and empty, like they were driving through a world that had ceased to exist. Minutes passed, then an hour. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She should have seen something by now. A streetlight, a gas station sign, another car. But there was nothing. Her fingers tapped against her thigh. "Hey," she finally said, trying to keep her voice light. "How much longer to town?" The man didn't answer. Vanessa turned her head slightly. He was still staring straight ahead, his face blank, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "Sir?" She tried again. "How much longer?" This time he spoke. "We're almost there." His voice was flat, emotionless. A chill crept up her spine. She glanced down at her phone, hoping for a signal. Still nothing. But what really made her stomach drop was the time displayed on the screen. 1:14 ke samay. The same as before. That wasn't possible. She had been in the car for nearly an hour. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned her gaze back to the window, hoping, praying, to see some sign of civilization. but the view outside remained unchanged. They were still on the same stretch of road, her hands clenched into fists. "Listen, I think I'd like to get out now." The man didn't react. Vanessa's heart pounded. She reached for the door handle, locked. She fumbled for the buttons on her side, trying to unlock it, but nothing worked. Panic surged through her. "Let me out," she demanded, voice rising in fear. The man didn't blink. His grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles nearly bone white. Then he turned his head. But it wasn't a normal movement. His neck twisted too far, too unnaturally, his head turning almost completely around to face her. His face wasn't human anymore. The skin had peeled away, revealing a black void where his features should have been. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, just an endless, hungry darkness. Vanessa screamed. The car suddenly lurched forward, accelerating at an impossible speed. The world outside blurred, the road stretching infinitely in every direction. The headlights no longer illuminated asphalt, just more darkness. She clawed at the door, kicked the dashboard, tried to pry the seatbelt off her body. "Let me out!" she shrieked. The man, or the thing pretending to be a man, leaned in closer. That empty void where its face should have been inched closer to hers. "We're almost there." Vanessa's vision blurred. The air around her was too thick, too heavy. She couldn't breathe. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the clock on the dashboard. She woke up on the side of the road. The sun was rising, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold. Her car was there, parked exactly where she had left it the night before. The highway was empty. She gasped, sitting up too fast, her head spinning. Her phone lay beside her in the dirt. She grabbed it, fingers trembling. A single notification blinked on the screen. New voicemail. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, hesitantly, she pressed play. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, that same gravelly voice. "We're almost there." Vanessa never hitchhiked again. The rain had been relentless for hours. It hammered against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists, turning the dark, empty highway into a blur of water and shadows. The rhythmic swish of the wipers was the only sound keeping David company as he pressed forward, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His eyes burned with exhaustion, but he forced himself to stay alert. He still had miles to go before he could rest. It was nearly 3 a.m., that strange liminal hour when the world feels unnervingly quiet, like something is watching just beyond the reach of the headlights. David had been driving cross-country for a new job, a fresh start. He had left behind a city that had drained him, friends who had drifted away, and an ex-girlfriend who had once meant everything. The highway was his escape, a path towards something new. But then he saw him. A lone figure stood at the edge of the road, barely visible in the rain and darkness. He wasn't moving, just standing there with one arm outstretched, thumb pointed toward the sky. David's stomach twisted. A hitchhiker. Normally, he would have driven past without a second thought, but something about this man caught his attention. His posture was too stiff, too rigid, like he had been standing there for hours. And his clothing. David squinted through the rain. The man's coat was old-fashioned, a long, dark trench coat that looked more fitting for the 1950s than the present day. His wide-brimmed hat was pulled low over his face, obscuring his features completely. A gut feeling told David to keep driving, but his foot hesitated over the gas pedal. Before he could think it through, his hand moved on its own, flicking on the turn signal. He pulled over just a few feet ahead of the stranger. For a long moment, the man didn't move. Then, as if he had been expecting this, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. David swallowed hard, an uneasy feeling crawling up his spine. He reached over and unlocked the passenger side door. "Need a ride?" The man nodded, but still he said nothing. He opened the door and climbed inside, shutting it with a heavy thud. The car's interior immediately grew colder. David shivered, rubbing his arms as the air around him seemed to press in, thick and suffocating. The engine hummed softly, but the usual comforting warmth of the heater had vanished. He forced himself to brush it off. David pulled back onto the road. The rain was still coming down in sheets, making the drive treacherous. He focused ahead, trying to shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. "Where are you headed?" he asked. Silence. David glanced sideways. The hitchhiker sat motionless, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He wasn't dripping wet, despite having been standing in the rain for who knows how long. David's fingers tightened around the wheel. "You okay, man?" The hitchhiker slowly turned his head. For the first time, David got a proper look at his face. Or where his face should have been. His heart stopped. There were no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin stretched over a blank canvas, like something unfinished. David's breath caught in his throat, his entire body locked up, his pulse pounding in his ears. The car suddenly veered off the road. David barely had time to react before the vehicle spun out of control. The tires screamed against the slick pavement as the car skidded sideways, then crash. The world flipped, glass shattered, metal crunched. Then darkness. David awoke to the sound of dripping water. His body ached, his head throbbed from where it had slammed into the steering wheel. He groaned, blinking through the haze of pain and confusion. The car was still. He was tilted at an awkward angle in a ditch, rainwater pooling at his feet. The windshield was cracked, and the dashboard lights flickered weakly. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he tried to process what had just happened. Then, he remembered. The hitchhiker. David's pulse spiked as he whipped his head toward the passenger seat. Empty. The door was wide open, rain pouring in. David's hands trembled as he fumbled for his phone. He needed to call for help, now. But when he pressed the power button, the screen refused to turn on. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, right outside his window. David's breath hitched. He turned his gaze back to the road and froze. A figure stood just a few feet away, bathed in the glow of the flickering headlights. The hitchhiker, unmoving, watching. David's entire body screamed for him to run. But he couldn't. The faceless man took a step forward. David's fight-or-flight response finally kicked in. Ignoring the pain surging through his body, he shoved the door open and stumbled into the rain. His feet slipped in the mud as he ran, lungs burning, heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away. Behind him, the sound of wet, slow footsteps followed. He could feel it, that presence lurking just behind him. No matter how fast he ran, the hitchhiker never fell behind. It wasn't until the sun began to rise that David finally collapsed onto the roadside, gasping for breath. The footsteps were gone. The faceless man had vanished. A trucker spotted David and rushed him to the nearest hospital. The doctors found no evidence that anyone else had been in the car with him, no footprints in the mud, no signs of a passenger. David tried to explain, but no one believed him. They told him he must have been hallucinating from exhaustion, that the accident had rattled his mind. But David knew better, and to this day, whenever he drives long distances, he keeps his doors locked. Because somewhere out there, on some lonely highway, the faceless hitchhiker is still waiting for his next ride. Hitchhiking has always been a gamble, one that some travelers never return from. The open road may seem endless, but it holds secrets that are best left undiscovered. How many lost souls are still wandering, waiting for someone to stop? How many drivers have picked up passengers who were never truly there? The stories we've shared tonight are just a glimpse into the dark, unexplained horrors that have taken place on highways, back roads, and desolate stretches of asphalt where help is scarce and danger is far too real. Perhaps you've passed by a lone figure standing at the edge of the road, their thumb raised, their face hidden in shadow. Maybe you've even stopped for someone, only for them to disappear before reaching their destination. Or maybe you've been the one in need of a ride, only to find yourself trapped in a vehicle with someone, or something, that felt profoundly wrong. The next time you find yourself driving late at night, miles away from the nearest town, with only the hum of your tires and the flickering of headlights to guide you, ask yourself, are you really alone? The road may seem empty, but that doesn't mean unseen eyes aren't watching from the darkness, waiting for their next unsuspecting traveler. If you see a hitchhiker standing motionless on the side of the road, their clothes torn and their expression unreadable, don't stop. If your gut tells you something isn't right about the person climbing into your passenger seat, listen to it. And if your new companion vanishes before your very eyes, leaving only the lingering scent of decay or a cold whisper in the wind, drive faster and never look back. Because some passengers never truly leave. Stay safe, stay aware, and whatever you do, never stop for the wrong person. Have you ever had a terrifying hitchhiking experience? Have you encountered something strange on the open road? We want to hear from you. Share your own horror stories with us, and you might see them featured in a future video. Send in your scariest real-life encounters, and let the world know what lurks in the darkness.